The morning air was thick with frost and silence, broken only by the distant clatter of a tram and the faint hiss of wind brushing against the barbed coils above the Berlin Wall. Fog lay heavy over the Tiergarten, cloaking the once grand trees and crumbling stone statues in ghostly white. A single street lamp, yellowed and stuttering with electrical fatigue, cast a trembling halo over a wooden bench whose paint had long since peeled away. And there it sat, unmoving, unassuming, almost mournful in its stillness. A black leather briefcase, seams worn, a small tear on one corner, a clasp left slightly ajar. Crows circled overhead, cawing once, then scattering into the mist. The city hadn't yet stirred. East Berlin remained wrapped in curfews and curdled suspicion. West Berlin buzzed faintly in the distance, guarded by shadows in uniforms and silence. No footsteps echoed through the park, no witnesses, no owner in sight. But if one were to peer closer, past the light's flicker and the fog's veil, they might notice the monogram barely etched into the leather. AK, subtle yet precise. Somewhere beneath the stitched lining, beyond the tobacco smell that lingered on the handle, history crouched in ambush. That briefcase, seemingly misplaced, had not simply been forgotten. It had been left, deliberately, planted like a seed in soil fertile with fear and mistrust. Nearby, on a rooftop, unseen, the lens of a long-range camera turned with the soft, predatory motion of a machine trained in patience. Its shutter clicked once, then again, as it captured stills that would later vanish into sealed dossiers. At that very moment, a man in a worn overcoat stepped from a side street, lit a cigarette with a trembling match, and stared not at the bench, but at the empty path leading away from it, as if watching the ghost of someone he'd failed to follow. The fog swallowed him just as it had the street lamps, and the scene fell still again. Somewhere behind concrete walls and reinforced doors, a receiver buzzed with static, then a voice. Package confirmed. Retrieval in motion. But for now, the briefcase remained untouched, unclaimed. Berlin, divided, exhausted, and always listening, held its breath. Beneath that bench, beneath the city's fraying nerves and political stalemates, something had shifted, like the first hairline fracture in a dam. It would take days, weeks perhaps, for the first ripples to register. But in this moment, 06:17 a.m., November 4th, 1962, the fuse had been lit, and no one on either side of the Iron Curtain was ready for the detonation to come. Fade to black. The screen lingers for a heartbeat. Then, on-screen text. How a Lost Briefcase Triggered the Largest Spy Hunt of the Cold War. A title more true than anyone watching could possibly imagine. The morning patrol was routine, or at least it was supposed to be. 3 East German border guards in damp olive-green uniforms, their boots sinking slightly into the wet leaves that blanketed the path skirting the Tiergarten wall, their rifles slung more for show than readiness, their breath fogging the already heavy air. They moved in silence, practiced and bored, glancing occasionally at the skyline beyond the wall, as if to reassure themselves that West Berlin hadn't disappeared overnight. At a 6:43, just 26 minutes after the briefcase had been left, Oberfeldwebel Martin Hesse spotted it, a dark form beneath the flickering lamplight, resting innocently on a bench where no one should have been sitting. He paused, signaled the others, and approached with the weary suspicion that accompanied everything unclaimed in this city of spies. "Civilian trash," muttered one, nudging the case with the barrel of his rifle. But Hesse, a man with 13 years of Cold War cynicism behind his eyes, knelt and opened it with the careful hands of someone who had once seen a child's toy explode. Inside, mundane clutter, 2 chewed packs of gum, American, 5 transit receipts, British sector, a folded street map of Berlin with red ink circles around the U.S. Embassy, the French consulate, and the Zoologischer Garten station, and beneath them all, partially obscured by a water-stained envelope, a crumpled page that stopped Hesse cold. It bore the seal of NATO, clear despite the smudge of wet tobacco across its lower half, and the words, "Eyes Only, Top-Level Briefing, Op Westward Save," typed in clean courier font. He blinked, once, then again. This couldn't be real. Not here. Not like this. He glanced at the others, who had leaned in and fallen suddenly quiet. None of them spoke. Hesse unfolded the paper, revealing a partial logistics table detailing troop realignments near the Fulda Gap, information no civilian should see, let alone discard on a public bench. "We report this. Immediately," he said, voice low, decisive. One of the others hesitated. It could be bait, but Hesse had already sealed the case and pulled his field radio from his coat. "Command, this is Falcon 3. We have a package. Tiergarten perimeter. Possible western leak." From somewhere behind them, a pigeon took flight, its wings thudding against the air like a distant drum. The camera zooms in on the NATO sigil, glinting as the briefcase snaps shut, locking history back inside it. Back at HQ, the call sent up a chain reaction. The Stasi was contacted, a sealed courier dispatched, and by 0719, the briefcase had vanished from the park, spirited away to a gray concrete room beneath Berlin where men in suits smoked without blinking and debated whether what they now held was real or a ruse. But one thing was certain. Someone had made a mistake, and somewhere across the wall, someone would soon realize it and begin to panic. In a secure briefing room beneath the U.S. mission in West Berlin, where every wall hummed faintly with the presence of wiretaps, and where every mirror was suspect, the man known only as Kestrel sat beneath a single buzzing light, his face a map of unreadable lines, his fingers interlaced tightly atop a folder marked with the embossed seal of the State Department. His real name, Philip Warren Langley, was only used in files buried under layers of encryption and denial. But among intelligence circles, he was Kestrel, observer, courier, ghost. The Stasi's sudden broadcast of the NATO page had set off alarm bells from Langley's handler in Bonn to the inner offices of Shape in Casteau. Within hours, fingers pointed. The map, the chewing gum. American. The receipts, timed to Langley's recent diplomatic route. The handwriting on the red circles. A close match. But when the folder was opened before him, and the photographs of the contents laid bare, Langley didn't flinch. "I've never seen this before," he said, voice even, clipped, as though the weight of accusation was merely another piece of furniture in the room. "I haven't been near Tiergarten in weeks." The interrogator, a man from Langley's own side, wearing a tie 3 shades too loud for a spy, tilted his head. "You're certain?" Langley met his gaze. "As certain as I am that you don't trust me." That was the problem, wasn't it? No one could trust anyone in Berlin. Dual lives were the currency of survival. Men shook hands in press conferences by day and slipped film canisters into hollowed bricks by night. Langley's known associations didn't help. A Polish attaché with a history of gambling, a German mistress with a brother in Leipzig, a driver who once served in the Wehrmacht. He was too clean, too careful, and now that carefulness looked like concealment. His diplomatic credentials didn't matter anymore. Somewhere in East Berlin, the briefcase sat dissected by men who assumed it had slipped from his fingers. But Langley, Kestrel, was not the type to forget. He was the type to leave things deliberately, to vanish when watched, to mislead even his own allies. "Someone is setting me up," he said at last, softer now, eyes narrowing as if glimpsing a shadow at the edge of a memory. Someone with access, someone who wants this found. The room chilled. The possibility twisted tighter. If not Kestrel, then who? Who had just handed the Soviets a page that shouldn't have existed? The question hung in the silence, alive, breathing. Outside, rain began to fall in cold threads against the embassy windows, and Langley remained seated, staring at the photographs, not with recognition, but with a fury born of betrayal. Somewhere, his ghost had acted without him. Or worse, someone had learned how to wear his mask. And in a world ruled by appearances and deception, that mask, his name, his methods, his trust, was now a loaded weapon in someone else's hands. In a low-ceilinged operations chamber 3 stories beneath Lubyanka Square, where stale cigarette smoke clung to velvet wallpaper like the ghosts of failed agents, and every footstep echoed like a confession, the nerve center of Soviet counterintelligence pulsed with quiet intensity. A single tungsten lamp illuminated the center of the room, casting long, shifting shadows over a table-sized map of Western Europe, its surface pocked with colored pins, red string, and black and white headshots, the holy altar of Operation Glasnost. Around the table stood 5 men in dark suits, their expressions carved from granite, their eyes scanning the latest Western cable intercepts as if decoding prophecy. The briefcase had done its job, more than they'd hoped. NATO's inner circle was spinning, and buried within a secure channel between West Berlin and Langley, the Americans had confirmed it. Someone had leaked OP westward sieve. Someone had lost control. One of the KGB operatives, Colonel Mikhail Vedenin, a veteran of Budapest and mentor to moles now embedded in 5 Western capitals, smiled faintly, running a gloved finger from Brussels to Bonn to Berlin on the map, each city marked by fresh red indicators, newly added in the past 48 hours. "The fish are biting," he said in low Russian. "Time to tighten the net." Operation Glasnost, once a slow-burn infiltration strategy aimed at recruiting ideologically disillusioned NATO officers, now accelerated into its final phase. The planted briefcase, assembled weeks earlier in a safe house near Gorky Park and smuggled through diplomatic back channels, was never meant to reach Stasi hands, but rather serve as a signal flare, a flash designed to trigger panic, to smoke out nervous insiders already teetering on the edge of betrayal. The files had been carefully selected, real enough to be credible, incomplete enough to be useless, but damning enough to prompt interrogations across the NATO command structure. Already, surveillance in West Germany had picked up signs of what Vedenin called the unraveling. Encrypted calls between field stations, emergency audits of personnel logs, an unusual order rerouting 2 logistics officers from SHAPE headquarters to an undisclosed location for debriefing. These weren't coincidences. They were patterns, and in Moscow patterns meant openings. The colonel tapped twice on the photo of a Belgian major posted in Brussels, codenamed Lyric, whose wife had recently vanished on a train to Zurich, and who now owed Moscow both silence and loyalty. "Activate him," Vedenin ordered. A nod followed. Across the table, another analyst slid forward a new dossier marked in red. OP Comet Dusk, Initiate Phase 2. Somewhere else in the room, a reel-to-reel recorder captured Western radio chatter in real time. In Berlin, the Americans were looking for a ghost. In Moscow, they were building one. The briefcase, they all knew, was not lost. It was left. The Stasi were not its final audience. They were merely the messenger pigeons. What mattered was the chaos now being harvested behind closed doors on the other side of the wall. Vedenin turned off the lamp with a decisive click, plunging the room into near darkness, and whispered, "Let them chase shadows. We hold the mirror." It began with a memo, bland on the surface, stamped confidential, and circulated to a select ring of NATO security directors, its language sterile, its implications anything but. Initiate internal security reevaluation in light of recent breach. From that moment, panic did not erupt. It oozed, slow and insidious, a poison with no smell but devastating reach. In the sprawling NATO command centers from Mons to Norfolk, quiet protocols turned into frenzied reviews as clearance levels were rechecked, access logs dissected, travel reports backdated and cross-verified. Entire weeks of operation ground to a crawl as intelligence officers were pulled from posts and ushered into stark rooms with one-way mirrors and not enough air. Colleagues who shared coffee now traded glances with knives behind them. The air thickened, not with smoke, but with suspicion. Files disappeared from desks. Keycards stopped working. Jokes dried up. Those who knew too much said less. Those who knew nothing started to guess. In Brussels, a British liaison officer named Caro was suspended after his weekend leave report didn't match fuel logs from his embassy car. In Naples, a Portuguese analyst was quietly escorted out after a single typo in his clearance code triggered a flag. These weren't guilty men, just convenient anomalies, but the dominoes had started to fall, and each tile bore a name. One by one, the fall spread. Not from guilt, but from doubt. Not from certainty, but from the fear of not knowing. Behind every locked office door, someone might be hiding the truth. Or worse, someone might be the truth, draped in the uniform of trust. "How do you find a traitor?" a French commandant whispered into his teacup, eyes flicking toward his adjutant. "When everyone wears the same uniform." The question echoed across briefing rooms, inside shredded memos, between walls no longer soundproof enough. Surveillance orders increased tenfold. Marriages cracked. Roommates turned informants. At SHAPE headquarters, a quiet directive was issued. All personal correspondence of intelligence staff would now be screened for patterns. No one defined patterns. Everyone suspected theirs had been seen. A secretary cried in the bathroom after discovering her letters home were missing pages. A Czech-born logistics officer was placed on indefinite leave after a tip accused him of humming a Soviet anthem in the break room. A falsehood, but too specific to ignore. The dominoes fell faster. In Washington, whispers of another mole, capital M, circulated behind bulletproof glass. Meanwhile, agents in the field, frozen out of briefings and left in silence, began to invent explanations for the vacuum. And in Berlin, Philip Langley, Kestrel, watched the world he knew tilt off its axis. He was no longer under suspicion, but he was no longer trusted either. Suspicion, once a scalpel, had become a hammer. Everyone was either a liar or a liability, and no one knew, which was worse. 3 officers sat across 3 rooms, each isolated by concrete and suspicion, each unaware of how close they were to ruin or redemption. The walls were bare, save for the ticking of identical clocks, synchronized to the second, and the low hum of tape recorders turning like silent witnesses. They were men of rank, of decorum, the kind who once shook hands at NATO banquets and signed off on security clearances without hesitation. But now, under the surgical glare of interrogation lamps, they resembled 3 versions of the same broken mirror. Lieutenant Colonel James Albright of the Royal Air Force, Officer 1, stared down his accuser with a practiced sneer, his brow moist, his hand trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette that danced between his fingers. "You think I'd risk it all for a piece of paper?" he hissed, voice tight, tired of repeating himself. But something in his tone frayed at the edges. Because he knew what paper could do, what secrets they carried like silent bombs. Captain Henri Duval, Officer 2, French liaison to the NATO communications desk, was cooler. Too cool. "I never saw that briefcase," he said with the faintest trace of insult in his clipped accent. Eyes calm, shoulders squared, but under the table his foot tapped a relentless beat. His name had surfaced on a transportation log near the park the morning of the drop. Coincidence, he claimed. A glitch in the record. No one believed in coincidence anymore. Then there was Officer 3, Major Arno Keller, logistics, German Army, the only one who said nothing. He sat motionless, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, his jaw locked in an expression that hovered somewhere between guilt and defiance. Not even a denial, just the stare of a man who'd already rehearsed every outcome. Investigators, one British, one American, one Belgian, compared notes behind mirrored glass. Each suspect had motive, each had opportunity, each had some trace of DNA or timing that put them within the same 2 kilometers of the Tiergarten briefcase. And yet, the details never lined up. Albright had authorization to see OP Westward Sieve, but denied any knowledge of its contents. Duval had the keys to the courier vault and was unaccounted for during a crucial 20-minute window. Keller's name was written in a different hand on a requisition slip, someone else's. And still, no one cracked. The questions repeated, the answers looped, only the hands told the truth. Zoom in. A droplet of sweat tracing the curve of Albright's wrist. Zoom in. Duval's fingers tightening on the edge of the table, then releasing, then tightening again. Zoom in. Keller's nails digging into his own palm, leaving crescent moons of doubt. Outside the interrogation suite, Langley watched the footage in silence. 3 men. 3 stories. 1 lie woven into 2 truths. But which thread would unravel first? In the end, someone had touched that briefcase. Someone had left it. But until someone broke, they were all guilty, and none of them could be trusted. It wasn't supposed to go this far, this deep into paranoia, this close to fracture. But by the time the truth surfaced, the machine had already begun to eat itself, and what was left of NATO's trust was too cracked to hold. In a sealed intelligence debrief chamber beneath the Allied Command Operations Complex in Casteau, Belgium, a revelation unfolded in breathless, brutal detail. The briefcase, that black leather specter which had ignited investigations, suspensions, and ruined careers, had not been lost, nor forgotten, nor smuggled. It had been planted. By NATO. More precisely, by a small counterintelligence task force within the Allied Security Directorate, authorized to run a clandestine canary trap under the codename Project Greathatch. The report inside was fake, crafted with surgical care, laced with deliberate errors and a falsified operation name, OP Westward Sieve, which never existed beyond the forged page. But the real brilliance, or madness, lay in the page itself. Microfilament threads, red, less than a human hair wide, woven into the fiber, each coded to emit a unique radio frequency when scanned with a short-range receiver. A hidden tracking measure, experimental, known only to 3 officers and buried under 4 layers of need-to-know clearance. The idea had been simple. Bait a suspected leak by slipping the fake document into a closed circle of 3, then track its movement. If the page showed up outside the walls, if the wrong hands touched it, the mole would be exposed. But the plan derailed when the page, meant to be noticed and removed in a controlled environment, vanished without protocol. The agent assigned to monitor it, Major Arno Keller, had gone off script. Fearing he'd been burned, or that the document was too hot to hold, he had panicked. Rather than following instructions, he smuggled the briefcase out of the facility, bypassing internal sensors with a forged clearance patch, and abandoned it in the Tiergarten, hoping the page would disappear forever, taking his name with it. But the opposite happened. The Stasi found it. The trap designed to smoke out a mole triggered a firestorm that engulfed the entire agency. And when NATO security scanned the retrieved page under controlled lab light and saw the torn lower corner glowing faint red under infrared, the room fell silent. Zoom in, the page's edge, ragged, torn as if ripped in haste. Beneath the surface, the embedded red filament curled out like blood. "The filament proves it," muttered one analyst. "It never should have left the room." Irony clanged louder than any alarm. There was no Russian leak, no Soviet breach. The page was fiction, the hunt a self-inflicted wound, the chaos birthed from a lie meant to preserve the truth. And in that chaos, real trust had collapsed. Systemic failure didn't come from betrayal. It came from fear, from assumptions, from the institutional certainty that deception was always out there, never within. But the worst damage had already been done, and the cost wouldn't be measured in briefings or reprimands. It would be measured in the silence between allies who no longer looked each other in the eye. The rain came in sheets that night, cold, heavy, relentless, beating down on the stone alleys of East Kreuzberg with a rhythm that masked footsteps and swallowed confessions. But the men waiting in the shadows did not need to hear. They already knew where he would be. Lieutenant Arno Keller, once the rising star of NATO's logistics command, the officer whose meticulous reports and midnight briefings had earned nods from generals and quiet praise in Pentagon cables, had become the hunted. His final move, a desperate sprint to Prague through back-channel train routes and falsified travel papers, had failed before it began. The moment he slipped through the east perimeter gate of his barracks, someone pressed a silent alarm. By the time he reached the cobblestone courtyard near the abandoned checkpoint, boots already echoed against the wet stone, encircling him like the final click of a lock. No one shouted, no warnings, just the sound of a hand reaching slowly into a coat, his own hand, fingers brushing against the cold steel of the small-caliber pistol he hadn't fired in years. He hesitated, then froze. "Don't," said a voice behind him, quiet, familiar. Langley. Kestrel. The ghost who wasn't a traitor, the man Keller had tried to frame with misplaced detail and misdirection. Now Langley stood beneath a dripping awning, collar high, eyes low, flanked by two security officers in plain clothes. Keller's shoulders sagged. He turned, rain streaming down his face like a mask melting from his bones. In the silence, Langley stepped forward, not as an agent, not as a spy, but as someone who once called Keller a friend. "Why?" he asked, not with venom, not with victory, but with the hollow ache of someone who had waited for a different truth. Keller didn't answer. There was no speech, no last-minute plea, only the faintest shake of the head and the slow, mechanical lift of his arms as the cuffs clicked over his wrists. Mirror imagery burned like a brand. This was the same man who had once delivered patriotic speeches at the officers' club, standing tall, voice unwavering as he spoke of duty, of honor, of standing against the red tide. Now, soaked to the bone, wrists bound, eyes empty, he looked like a shell hollowed out by shame. His arrest wasn't just a betrayal of country. It was a betrayal of the men who had trusted him, drank with him, bled beside him in war games and behind diplomatic lines. Langley watched as Keller was led away down the alley, the back of his coat flapping like a ruined flag, footsteps vanishing into the downpour. And in that moment, with the last echoes fading into rain, it was clear. This wasn't the end of a spy story. This was the unraveling of faith, the realization that the greatest threat had not crossed the wall, but had shared quarters, meals, secrets. Some ghosts haunt from the outside, But Keller had haunted from within. And now, finally, the phantom wore chains. It began, as history so often does, with something small, a bag, forgotten or planted, left on a bench beneath a broken lamp in a fog-choked park. But what followed would swell into one of the most sweeping internal purges the Western Alliance had ever endured, a slow-motion implosion that rippled outward from that bench to the polished floors of NATO command centers and the marble steps of foreign ministries, toppling reputations, reassigning lives, and fracturing trust in ways no bullet ever could. Within 3 days of Keller's arrest, over 120 NATO personnel found themselves under review. Officers, clerks, translators, even janitors who happened to walk the wrong corridor at the wrong time. Files were reopened, long archived surveillance footage pulled from dust-caked reels, whispered accusations given weight with no more evidence than proximity or a paused sentence. In Naples, a naval attaché was reassigned to Reykjavik without explanation. In Lisbon, a signals technician was stripped of clearance for failing to report a brother-in-law's political activism. In Paris, a respected analyst with 20 years of service was placed on indefinite leave for a decades-old letter that referenced growing doubts about Western strategy. No trials, no convictions, just shadows, whispered suspicions, and cold transfers handed across desks like death notices. Morale cracked first, then it crumbled. Officers stopped speaking freely in lounges. Jokes were weighed for hidden meanings. Friendships thinned. People no longer sat beside each other in the cafeteria. Surveillance cameras were installed in rooms that once held private briefings. A general visiting from Washington was recorded murmuring, "It's a witch hunt," to his aide. He was recalled within 48 hours. The Soviets, meanwhile, did not gloat publicly. They didn't need to. Pravda's front page carried only a single line beneath the masthead, a smirk in ink. Western integrity, brief and cased. But behind closed doors, toasts were made in silent glee. The Red Orchestra, long quiet, suddenly found new music in the disarray. Defectors who had once hesitated now picked up phones. Recruits long nurtured in diplomatic corridors felt the wind shift and leaned eastward. What NATO lost in data, the Soviets gained in momentum. Fade in, newspaper headlines flashing across the screen. Breach confirmed. Le Monde. Security vacuum at shape. The Times. Pentagon orders full review. The Washington Post. Each more damning than the last, each a wound not just to image but to ideology. What began as a test, a trap designed to uncover a single leak, had detonated like a hidden charge beneath the alliance's foundation. And all of it, from first to last, had sprung from one object, a black briefcase, half forgotten, half strategic, placed in the cold by a man who would come to regret both the act and the silence that followed. History books would struggle to name all the careers undone, the policies reshaped, the alliances redefined in the months that followed. But somewhere, buried in the footnotes, would linger the truth too strange for fiction. Sometimes, it only takes one lie left in the right place to set an empire doubting itself. A briefcase left behind. A war fought in silence. In the end, no bombs fell. But reputations did. The voiceover comes low, almost a whisper against the grainy hum of archive footage. Black and white images of the Berlin Wall, its concrete skin cracked and towering, splitting the city like a scar still fresh. Soldiers pacing its length with expressions carved from stone. In one shot, a West German boy holds a balloon just inches from the wall's shadow, unaware that beyond it, entire lives are being shredded in filing cabinets and interrogation rooms. As the camera lingers, the imagery dissolves slowly, like memory thinning into myth, and shifts to a modern-day street. The same coordinates, but now quiet, ordinary. Trees sway in autumn light. A cyclist passes under the spot where the checkpoint once stood, and a couple walks by, hand in hand, where once rifles were cradled nervously beneath trenchcoats. The city moves on, but beneath its cobblestones lie echoes, faint but not forgotten. Narration continues, tone reflective but edged with quiet awe. What began as an experiment in loyalty spiraled into a theater of doubt, a stage where truth wore many faces and masks were traded like currency. In the Cold War, the weapons weren't always steel or smoke. They were paper, whispers, absence, the missing page, the silent phone, the man who no longer looked you in the eye. And then comes the twist of irony, the revelation that lingers like breath on glass. The briefcase was never meant to destroy, it was meant to protect, but in trying to root out betrayal, it sowed distrust more deeply than any enemy could. Systemic collapse not from invasion, but from introspection sharpened into paranoia. The camera cuts, faces flash across the screen in silent freeze frames. Langley, standing alone in the rain. Keller, eyes downcast, hands bound. The nameless border guards who opened the case without knowing they were detonating a crisis. These were not heroes, not villains, just men caught in machinery too vast to escape. The music swells, not triumphant, but haunting, and we return to the street in present-day Berlin, empty now, just wind curling through the trees. A child on a scooter rides past the bench, not knowing the weight once carried there. Narration. History doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through the things we leave behind. The screen fades slowly to black, leaving only a soft echo of the wind and the distant chime of a bell. Whether from a train station or a church tower, it's unclear, and that's the point. The Cold War didn't end in a bang. It never truly ended. It changed masks, it moved shadows, and in those shadows, it waits to be remembered. Text fades in. Subscribe to uncover the shadows of history. A final beat of music, minor key, unresolved, leaves the story hanging just long enough to remind us that some mysteries are never fully closed. They are only left behind, like a briefcase, in the fog at dawn. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up. We would really appreciate it.